The first lesson Clara Bennet learned as Duchess of Whitmore was that a heart could break without making a sound. The rain had begun before sunset, sweeping across the Massachusetts coast in silver sheets and striking the tall windows of Whitmore Hall with a patience that felt almost cruel. Inside, the old stone mansion glowed with candles and polished mahogany, its corridors dressed in white roses for a wedding that had never once felt like a celebration. Clara stood in the bridal chamber with her gloved hands folded before her, the lace at her wrists damp from the storm, and the hem of her ivory gown darkened where it had brushed the carriage steps. She was 23, fair-skinned, quiet by nature, and still young enough to believe that kindness, if offered gently enough, might one day be returned. Across the room, Duke Alexander Whitmore removed his black coat and laid it over the back of a chair with the careful precision of a man putting away a legal document. He was tall, pale, and severe, with dark hair damp from the rain and gray eyes that seemed to belong more to the winter sea than to any living man. The fire behind him burned brightly, yet the room remained cold. Clara watched him in the mirror, searching for some softening in his face, some sign that beneath the title, the vows, and the silence at the altar, there might be a husband who understood that she had left behind her girlhood that morning. Alexander did not look at her. On the small table beside the fireplace lay the Whitmore family ring, heavy with age, its diamond catching the candlelight like a frozen tear. He picked it up, turned it once between his fingers, and set it down again as though even that gesture cost him more feeling than he wished to spend. "There is one thing we should understand before this marriage becomes burdened with expectations," he said. His voice was low, polished, and empty of warmth. Clara lifted her chin. "Of course, Your Grace." At that title, something almost like irritation moved across his mouth. "I did not marry for companionship. I did not marry for poetry, confidences, or sentimental domestic rituals. Whitmore needs continuity. The estate needs an heir." The rain struck harder against the glass. Clara felt the words before she understood them, each one settling into her chest like a stone lowered into deep water. Still, she remained still. Her mother had taught her composure. Poverty had taught her endurance. Loneliness, long before marriage, had taught her how not to reach for a hand that was not being offered. Alexander finally turned toward her, and for the first time that night his eyes met hers fully. There was no hatred in them. That was almost worse. Hatred would have meant she mattered enough to disturb him. His expression held only duty, cold and ancient. "Give me an heir, not conversation." For a moment, the entire room seemed to vanish except for the space between them. The candles trembled. The roses on the mantel looked too white, too soft, too alive for such a sentence. Clara's fingers tightened once around the edge of her veil. She had imagined many kinds of disappointment. A distant husband, a solemn house, a marriage built slowly, perhaps awkwardly, with two strangers learning the shape of one another's wounds. But she had not imagined being dismissed before she had even been known. She did not cry. Tears would have given the room more truth than it deserved. Instead, she reached up and removed her veil with careful hands. The pins came loose one by one, releasing a few pale strands of hair against her cheek. She folded the veil over the back of the nearest chair, smoothing the lace as if it belonged to another woman's wedding, another woman's hope. When she looked at Alexander again, her face had become very calm. "Then I shall not trouble your grace with words." It was not defiance, not exactly. It was something quieter, and therefore more dangerous. Alexander's brows drew together, as though he had expected trembling, apology, perhaps obedience sweetened with gratitude. Clara gave him none of those things. She only curtsied, perfect and pale in the candlelight, then crossed the room to the adjoining sitting chamber, where a narrow sofa waited beneath a portrait of some forgotten Whitmore bride. She did not slam the door. She closed it gently. That gentleness stayed with him longer than anger would have. In the silence that followed, Alexander stood alone beside the fire, listening to the rain and to the faint rustle of satin beyond the wall. He told himself he had been honest. He told himself cruelty was sometimes merely clarity spoken without decoration. He told himself that women were safer when not invited into a man's ruin, and that his house, with all its marble halls and inherited ghosts, required discipline rather than tenderness. But in the next room, Clara sat upright in her wedding gown until dawn, her hands folded over the ring he had placed on her finger, learning the geography of a new life. By morning, the servants would find her composed. By breakfast, she would answer every question with grace. By the end of the week, she would know the names of every maid, every footman, every tenant child who waited outside the kitchen door for scraps of bread. And by the end of 1 year, Duke Alexander Whitmore would discover that the silence he had demanded from his wife had not made her empty. It had made her unreachable. By the 7th morning of her marriage, Clara Whitmore had learned the music of the house better than the voice of her husband. Whitmore Hall woke before sunrise, not with warmth, but with discipline. At 5 o'clock, the kitchen fires were lit behind the servants' corridor. At 6, the housemaids crossed the marble floors with pails of water and soft gray cloths. At 7, the butler opened the heavy front doors to let in the clean, salt-edged air from the Massachusetts coast. And at 8, Duchess Clara descended the eastern staircase in a gown of dove-colored wool, her fair face composed, her hair pinned neatly beneath a ribbon of pale blue, and her voice used only where duty required it. She did not ask whether His Grace would join her for breakfast. The answer had become unnecessary. Alexander took his coffee in the West Study, his correspondence beside him, his attention fixed upon estate reports, shipping ledgers, and the quiet machinery of a life arranged to avoid tenderness. Clara sat alone in the morning room, where white roses still remained from the wedding, their petals browning at the edges in a silver vase. The first few days, the servants had watched her with careful pity, waiting for tears, anger, complaints sent home to her family, perhaps even some pleading attempt to soften the Duke. None came. Clara buttered her toast, read the household accounts, thanked the footman by name, and allowed silence to gather around her like a shawl. By the end of the first month, she had stopped expecting footsteps outside her door. By the end of the second, she had learned the names of every tenant family within 12 miles of Whitmore land. By the end of autumn, the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellery, no longer asked whether the Duchess required anything for her own comfort, because the Duchess always asked first about someone else. There was a leaking roof at the miller's cottage. Clara sent Slate and 2 men before the next rain. There was a widow near the south pasture whose youngest son had outgrown his only boots. Clara arranged for leather from town and said nothing of the bill. There was a small schoolroom near the chapel that had been locked for 9 years because no one thought tenant children needed books in winter. Clara found the key, opened the shutters, and stood in the dust until sunlight crossed the floorboards like a blessing. When Alexander heard of it, he did not praise her. He merely signed the supply order placed before him and said, "If Her Grace wishes to occupy herself with charitable experiments, see that the expenses remain reasonable." Mrs. Ellery lowered her eyes. Clara, standing only a few feet away with a stack of folded linens in her arms, heard every word. She did not turn. She did not answer. That evening, she added 2 more desks to the schoolroom order and reduced the cost of her own winter gowns to balance the account. Whitmore Hall noticed, even if its master did not. The scullery maid noticed when the Duchess warmed her hands around a chipped cup of tea in the kitchen rather than ringing for service. The stable boy noticed when she remembered that his mother's cough worsened in damp weather. The old gardener noticed when she asked which roses had once been the late Duchess's favorites and which had been planted by Alexander's grandmother. Clara moved through the great stone mansion like a candle carried down a cold corridor, never demanding attention, yet changing the darkness simply by passing through it. Still, to the county, she became a question whispered behind fans and church gloves. Why had there been no announcement? Why did the Duke appear alone at the bank in Boston and at political dinners in Salem? Why did the Duchess smile so gently and speak so little? Some called her shy. Some called her proud. Others, less kind, called her disappointing. Clara heard the word once outside the chapel doors on a Sunday morning, spoken by a woman in violet silk who smelled of lavender and judgment. "A year will tell," the woman murmured. "A wife who gives no air must at least give charm." Clara paused for only half a breath. Then she stepped forward, took the arm of an elderly tenant who had been waiting uncertainly at the church steps, and guided him inside as though no cruel sentence had touched her at all. Across the aisle, Alexander saw the gesture. He also saw the woman in violet lower her eyes. For a moment, something unfamiliar moved in him, not admiration, not yet, but a faint discomfort, like a door somewhere in the house had opened without permission. That night, he passed the eastern sitting room and found Clara asleep in a chair beside a low fire, an account book open in her lap, ink smudged faintly on one finger. On the table lay lists of flour, coal, medicine, blankets, and names, so many names. Not society names. Not the names of people who could reward her. The names of children, widows, farmers, servants. Alexander stood at the threshold, his hand resting on the brass handle. He might have entered. He might have spoken. Instead, he closed the door softly and walked away. Clara woke minutes later to an empty room, looked toward the door as if some part of her had sensed a presence, then lowered her eyes and returned to her ledgers. By winter, Whitmore Hall had a duchess everyone depended upon and a duke who still believed he needed only an heir. He did not yet understand that the life of his house had already begun to beat in the silence of the woman he had refused to hear. The first true humiliation of Clara Whitmore's marriage did not arrive in private, where sorrow could at least keep its dignity, but beneath the chandeliers of the Whitmore charity luncheon, with 32 guests smiling over porcelain plates and pretending not to sharpen every word they heard. It was late January, and the Massachusetts coast lay under a pale crust of snow, the kind that made the sea look darker and the sky seem lower. Inside Whitmore Hall, the long dining room had been dressed for benevolence. White linen covered the table from end to end. Silver candlesticks stood between arrangements of winter roses and evergreen branches. Crystal glasses caught the firelight and broke it into trembling stars across the walls. Clara had spent 3 weeks preparing the luncheon to raise funds for the chapel school and the widow's coal relief. She had written every invitation by hand, reviewed every menu, chosen warm cider instead of champagne for the older guests, and arranged small parcels of bread and tea to be sent quietly to the tenant families before the visitors arrived. No one saw those details. Society rarely admired kindness unless it wore jewels. Clara wore pearl earrings and a gown of soft gray silk, modestly cut, elegant without pleading for attention. Her fair complexion looked almost luminous beneath the chandelier light, though anyone who watched carefully might have noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes. Alexander sat at the head of the table, formal and distant, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable as he listened to a Boston banker speak of shipping rates and winter losses. He had approved the luncheon because it benefited the Whitmore name. He had not asked what it cost Clara to make strangers feel welcome in a house where she herself had never been invited into warmth. Lady Margaret Whitmore arrived half an hour late, as she always did, carrying the authority of a woman who had ruled the family long before Clara entered it. Alexander's mother was pale, graceful, and cold in the practiced way of old aristocracy. She kissed Clara's cheek without touching it, and allowed her eyes to drift over the room as if searching for defects. "A charming effort, my dear," she said softly, which meant she had already found several. Clara only inclined her head. "You are kind to say so, Lady Margaret." During the soup course, the conversation turned, as Clara had feared it would, toward family lines, inheritances, and the importance of continuity. An older gentleman mentioned that his daughter had recently given birth to twin sons. The table brightened with congratulations. Lady Margaret smiled with delicate approval, then rested her gloved hand beside her spoon and let silence gather just long enough to become noticeable. "How fortunate," she said. "Some houses are blessed quickly. Others must wait and hope that duty is eventually understood." The air changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone to accuse her of cruelty. But Clara felt every face become still around her. A spoon paused against porcelain. A woman near the fireplace lowered her eyes. Alexander did not move. Clara looked down at her untouched soup, its surface shining under the candlelight. Lady Margaret continued, her voice soft enough to remain socially acceptable and sharp enough to wound. "A duchess has many pleasant occupations, of course. Schools, blankets, little charitable diversions. But in the end, a great house is not preserved by good intentions. It is preserved by heirs." A faint, nervous laugh moved among 2 of the guests, then died. Clara lifted her gaze to Alexander. Not pleading, not accusing, simply looking. He heard. She knew he heard. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. That silence did what Lady Margaret's words could not. It removed the last small shelter Clara had kept for him in her heart. Before anyone could speak again, a small crash sounded near the serving doors. A tenant child, brought in with her mother to help carry baskets for the relief parcels, had stumbled and dropped a tray of rolls onto the polished floor. The girl froze, cheeks burning, eyes wide with terror at the room full of silk and judgment. A footman stepped forward quickly, but Clara was already rising. Every head turned as the Duchess of Whitmore crossed the dining room, lowered herself to the floor in her gray silk gown, and gathered the fallen bread with her own hands. "It is all right, Emma," she said gently. "No one has been harmed." The child whispered, "I am sorry, Your Grace." Clara smiled, and this time the smile reached something real in her face. "Then we shall be sorry together and fix it together." She took a clean napkin from the sideboard, placed the rolls aside, and touched the girl's trembling fingers with quiet reassurance. In that moment, kneeling beneath the gaze of people who measured women by titles, heirs, and usefulness, Clara looked less like a failed duchess than the only noble person in the room. Lady Margaret's mouth thinned. Alexander watched from the head of the table, and something inside him shifted with an unease he could not name. He had seen Clara silent. He had seen her composed. He had seen her useful, gracious, obedient to the shape of the life he had given her. But he had never seen silence turn into judgment. When Clara returned to her seat, she did not look at him again. For the rest of the luncheon, she spoke only when required, and every word was flawless. The donations exceeded expectation. The guests praised the food, the cause, the elegance of the house. Lady Margaret departed with her head high and her victory uncertain. That evening, after the last carriage disappeared down the snow-lined drive, Alexander found Clara standing alone in the chapel schoolroom, still in her gray silk gown, arranging small books on the desks by lamplight. "My mother can be difficult," he said from the doorway. Clara placed one book beside another. "Yes, Your Grace. You handled the afternoon well." Her hand stilled for the briefest moment. Then she continued arranging the books. "I handled Emma well. The afternoon handled itself." Alexander frowned, and used to hearing the edge beneath her softness. "Clara." She turned then, calm, pale, and farther from him than the length of the room could explain. "Do not concern yourself, Your Grace. I remember the terms of my usefulness." The lamp between them flickered. Outside, snow brushed against the windows like 1,000 quiet warnings. Alexander had no answer, because for the first time, his wife had not asked for one. The secret Clara carried did not live in her body alone. It lived in the locked drawer of a small writing desk in the eastern sitting room, folded between a pressed white rose and a letter that had never reached the man whose name stood above hers in the family Bible. 3 weeks after the charity luncheon, February settled over Whitmore Hall with a cold so pure it seemed to turn every window into silver. The sea beyond the cliffs moved under a ceiling of low clouds, black and restless, while the lawns lay quiet beneath 6 inches of snow. Inside the house, Clara continued as she always had. She visited the chapel school each morning, reviewed the kitchen accounts before noon, sent blankets to the north cottages, answered invitations with perfect courtesy, and took her dinner alone unless duty required otherwise. No one would have guessed that the luncheon had changed anything. That was the danger of Clara's pain. It did not announce itself. It learned the room, took a seat in the corner, and waited. Alexander, however, had begun to notice what he once found convenient to ignore. He noticed that she never walked past the nursery corridor. He noticed that when Mrs. Ellery mentioned infants in the village, Clara's hand sometimes paused above the account book before moving again. He noticed that she wore pearls on Sundays, but never the small sapphire brooch his mother had sent her after the wedding, the one Lady Margaret said was appropriate for a young wife who understood her position. None of these things told him the truth. They only unsettled him, and Alexander disliked being unsettled by anything he could not command. One afternoon, while snow tapped softly against the glass, he entered the east wing in search of a charitable ledger he had been told required his signature. Clara was not there. Her sitting room held the gentle order of her presence. A folded shawl over the chair, a cup of untouched tea gone pale, a basket of mending beside the hearth, and a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon on the desk. He should have waited. He should have called for a maid. Instead, he saw his own name written on an envelope in Clara's careful hand, and stopped as if the ink itself had spoken. The letter was dated 11 months earlier, not long after their wedding. The seal had been broken and pressed closed again. Alexander lifted it slowly. The paper trembled once between his fingers, though his hand did not. "My lord," it began, "I apologize for disturbing you in Boston, but Dr. Hale believes I should not be alone tonight. There was a child, though only briefly. I do not know whether this news will grieve you or relieve you. I only know I was frightened, and for one foolish hour, I wished you were here." Alexander read the lines twice before understanding entered him with a silence colder than the February air. There had been a child. Not an heir in the legal language of his ledgers. Not continuity. Not a duty performed or failed. A child. Their child. And Clara had lost that small hope alone in the house that bore his name, while he had sat in Boston discussing estate succession with men who never once imagined the cost of such words to a woman waiting in a dark room. Beneath the letter lay another note from Dr. Hale, formal and restrained, advising rest, warmth, and the comfort of familiar companionship. A third paper bore Lady Margaret's small, elegant handwriting. "His Grace must not be burdened with delicate alarms until there is certainty. The Duchess will recover more gracefully if the matter remains private." Alexander stood motionless. The fire snapped behind him, too loud in the quiet room. He had spent a year believing Clara's silence was temperament, perhaps pride, perhaps disappointment disciplined into obedience. He had never considered that it might be grief with its mouth covered by someone else's hand. The door opened softly. Clara stood on the threshold in a dark blue winter dress, her fair face still from the cold outside, her gloves dusted with snow. Her eyes moved from his face to the letter in his hand. For one brief moment, something unguarded crossed her expression. Not anger, not even surprise. Only the weary recognition of a wound touched too late. Alexander tried to speak, but the words that had served him all his life, commands, explanations, formal apologies, became useless in his throat. Clara crossed the room and held out her hand. He gave her the letter. She folded it along the old creases with unbearable care and placed it back inside the drawer. "You were not meant to find that," she said. Her voice was gentle, which made it worse. "Clara," he managed, "why was I not told?" She looked at him then, and the distance in her eyes was not the distance of a wife from a husband. It was the distance of someone who had called across a storm and learned no one was coming. "I tried to tell you, Your Grace." Outside, the snow continued to fall over Whitmore Hall, softening every roof, every path, every graveled road to the sea. But inside Alexander Whitmore, nothing was softened. Something long protected had cracked, and through it came the first terrible understanding that his wife had not failed to give him a future. He had failed to stand beside her when one disappeared. The morning after Alexander found the letters, Whitmore Hall seemed to hold its breath around him. Nothing visible had changed. The same gray light spread over the Atlantic beyond the cliffs. The same servants moved through the corridors with lowered voices and polished trays. The same fire burned in the breakfast room, where Clara sat alone with a cup of tea cooling beside her untouched plate. Yet to Alexander, every familiar object had become an accusation. The empty chair opposite her, the folded newspaper no one had opened, the silver coffee pot reflecting her pale face in a distorted shimmer. He entered without announcement, and Clara looked up with the practiced calm that had once made him think she felt little. Now he understood that composure could be the final wall of a person who had been left too often in the cold. "May I sit?" he asked. The question sounded strange in his own house. Clara's eyes rested on him for a moment. "It is your table, Your Grace." He did not sit immediately. That answer, polite and perfect, landed with more force than reproach. "It has not felt like mine lately." "Then perhaps the house has become wise." The words were soft, but Mrs. Ellery, standing near the sideboard, went still. Alexander dismissed the servants with a small movement of his hand, and for the first time in months, husband and wife were alone over breakfast. He took the chair across from her. Between them lay 8 feet of polished mahogany, a distance that felt far greater than the miles he had traveled to Boston while she had needed him. "Clara," he began, "I did not know." She folded her hands in her lap. "No, had I known, I would have returned." She looked toward the window, where winter gulls wheeled above the sea. "Would you have?" The question was not cruel. It was worse. It was honest. Alexander had no immediate answer, because the man he had been 11 months earlier might have returned out of duty, out of concern for the Whitmore line, out of anger that information had been kept from him. But would he have returned for Clara herself? Would he have sat beside her through the night, held her hand without speaking of heirs, allowed her grief to exist without requiring it to justify itself? Silence answered before he could. Clara heard it. She rose. "I have lessons at the chapel school. I would like to come with you." That made her turn back. For the first time that morning, her composure shifted into surprise. Why? Such a simple word. Such a difficult wound beneath it. Alexander looked at her, really looked, at the tired shadows beneath her eyes, the ink stain on her finger, the guarded dignity in the set of her shoulders. "Because I have spent a year knowing the estate and not knowing the woman who saved it." Clara's face did not soften. "Do not mistake usefulness for invitation." Then she left him there with the cooling coffee and the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. But Alexander followed at a distance, not close enough to intrude, not proud enough to stay away. The chapel school stood half a mile from the main house, a whitewashed building near the edge of the village road. Snow lined the fence posts, and smoke rose from the small chimney in a thin blue thread. Inside, 20 children sat at mismatched desks, their cheeks pink from the cold, their hands wrapped around slates and pencils. Clara removed her gloves, tied an apron over her dark dress, and became someone Alexander had never seen before. Not a duchess performing charity, not a wife enduring judgment. A woman at ease in the only room that expected nothing from her but kindness. A little girl named Emma, the same child from the luncheon, stood proudly to read from a primer. She stumbled over several words, cheeks reddening. Clara knelt beside her and whispered encouragement until the child tried again. When Emma finished, the room applauded softly. Clara smiled, and the light of it moved through Alexander with a pain so sharp he lowered his eyes. He had not known she could smile like that. He had not earned the right to see it. During the lesson, one boy asked whether dukes ever learned to read when they were small. Clara glanced once toward the back of the room, where Alexander stood by the door. "Yes," she said, "but reading words is easier than understanding hearts." The children accepted this as wisdom and returned to their slates. Alexander accepted it as judgment. After the lesson ended, he remained outside while Clara helped button coats and distribute small parcels of bread and apples. Emma lingered last, clutching a book to her chest. "Your Grace," the child whispered to Clara, unaware Alexander could hear through the half-open door. "Does His Grace love you?" Clara's hands stilled on the ribbon of the child's bonnet. The winter air seemed to pause with her. At last, she answered quietly, "His Grace loves duty. That is a safer thing for a man like him." Emma frowned with the innocent seriousness of children. "Is duty warm?" Clara smiled sadly. "Not usually, dear one." Alexander stood outside in the snow, the cold seeping through his boots, and understood that he had given his wife shelter, name, and position, yet somehow left her unwarmed in every way that mattered. When Clara stepped out, she found him waiting beside the path. For once, he did not reach for command. He did not offer an excuse. He simply removed his gloves and held out his bare hand to help her over the icy step. Clara looked at it for a long moment. Then she gathered her skirts and stepped down without taking it. The refusal was small, quiet, devastating. Alexander lowered his hand, and the snow fell between them like all the words he had once forbidden and now did not know how to ask for. That evening, after Clara left him standing in the snow outside the chapel school, Alexander Whitmore returned to the house by a path he had not walked in years. It curved behind the old carriage house, past the frozen fountain, and beneath a row of bare elm trees whose black branches scratched softly at the winter sky. Whitmore Hall rose before him in solemn gray layers, its windows glowing with firelight, its chimneys breathing pale smoke into the darkening air. For most of his life, the sight had filled him with possession. This was his inheritance, his name, his duty carved into stone. But now, as he looked at the great house, he saw something else. He saw how easily stone could become a witness. It had witnessed Clara arrive in a rain-darkened wedding gown. It had witnessed her eat alone, work alone, grieve alone. It had witnessed his mother pass through its corridors with a smile too polished to be innocent. By the time he entered the west study, the lamps had already been lit, and his secretary had placed the day's correspondence in a neat stack beside the inkstand. Alexander did not sit. His eyes went instead to the locked cabinet near the bookshelves, where old estate documents were kept: leases, medical accounts, household reports, servant references, and anything Lady Margaret believed should remain properly ordered. Properly hidden, some colder instinct whispered. He sent for Mr. Alden, the old steward who had served Whitmore Hall since Alexander was a boy. The man arrived within minutes, thin and careful, with silver hair and hands that seemed always folded around a secret. "The household records from last spring," Alexander said. "Bring them." Mr. Alden's expression did not change, but the candlelight caught the faint movement in his throat. "Which records, Your Grace?" "All of them." The pause that followed was brief, yet it was enough. Alexander stepped closer. "Do not make me ask twice." Within the hour, boxes were carried from the archive room and placed across the study carpet. Alexander opened them himself. He found invoices for medicines sent from Salem, a receipt for a physician's late-night visit, and a notation in Mrs. Ellery's careful hand that her Grace was to be kept warm and spared all disturbance. Beneath those lay letters. Not one letter. Not two. A small bundle tied in cream ribbon, each addressed to him in Clara's hand, each seal broken before delivery, each one never sent beyond the walls of Whitmore Hall. He read them standing at first, then sitting, then with one hand pressed against the edge of the desk, as if the room had shifted beneath him. The earliest letters were practical, almost shy. Clara wrote about repairs needed in the South cottages, about the schoolroom, about a tenant family whose rent should be delayed until spring. Then the tone changed. "My lord, I know you are occupied in Boston, but Dr. Hale has asked whether you might return if convenient. I do not wish to exaggerate. I only confess that the house feels very large tonight." Another letter, written in a weaker hand, said, "I heard footsteps in the corridor and hoped they were yours. Forgive the foolishness." By the final letter, the words grew so few that they wounded more deeply than pages of accusation could have done. "I shall recover. Please do not be troubled." Alexander closed his eyes. In all his years of command, no battlefield of business, politics, or inheritance had ever defeated him so quietly. He looked up when the door opened and Lady Margaret entered without waiting to be announced. She wore black velvet and diamonds, as though mourning had become a fashion instead of a feeling. Her gaze moved to the papers spread across his desk. "I see you have been disturbing old matters." Alexander lifted one of the letters. "You opened these." "I preserved your peace." Her answer came too quickly. "You were negotiating the coastal shipping contract. The estate required your full attention." Clara was young, emotional, and uncertain. Women in such conditions often become dramatic. "She asked for me. She asked for comfort. There is a difference." The words settled into the room like frost. Alexander stared at his mother, and for the first time in his life, he saw not the guardian of Whitmore dignity, but the architect of a silence that had nearly swallowed his wife whole. "Who gave you the right?" he asked. Lady Margaret's chin lifted. "I was protecting this family." "No," he said very softly. "You were protecting the appearance of this family." Something flickered in her eyes then, annoyance perhaps, or fear that her son had finally learned to distinguish duty from cruelty. Alexander gathered the letters and held them against his chest, not as documents, but as evidence of a woman calling across a locked door. "From this night forward," he said, "no letter addressed to my wife, or written by my wife, passes through any hand but hers. No servant reports on her movements to you. No physician speaks to you before speaking to me and to her. No decision about Clara is made in rooms where Clara is absent." Lady Margaret's face hardened. "You will regret allowing sentiment to govern you." Alexander looked toward the dark window, where his reflection seemed older than it had that morning. "No, mother. I regret allowing coldness to govern me." Upstairs, in the eastern sitting room, Clara sat beside the fire mending the sleeve of a child's coat, unaware that the walls of Whitmore Hall had begun, at last, to give back the truth they had kept from her. And below, Alexander remained alone with every letter she had written, understanding that forgiveness could not be demanded like rent, inherited like land, or signed into existence like a contract. It would have to be earned word by word, after a year in which he had taught his wife that words were unwelcome. By the end of February, Clara Whitmore had made a decision so quietly that even the house, which had learned to listen for her footsteps, did not hear it coming. It began not with anger, but with exhaustion. She had spent the morning in the chapel school, helping Emma form careful letters across a slate, while snowmelt dripped from the eaves outside. She had spent the afternoon reviewing the coal accounts, discovering that 3 families near the North Road would not make it through another cold week without help. She had spent the evening at a small desk in the east sitting room, writing checks, folding notes, and ignoring the ache behind her eyes that came whenever Whitmore Hall grew too silent after dark. Alexander had changed since the discovery of the letters. She knew it. Everyone knew it. He no longer spoke to her, as if she were an arrangement placed in his house for the convenience of lineage. He asked before entering rooms. He listened when she spoke to the steward. He had dismissed Mr. Alden from private household authority and removed Lady Margaret from the management of all domestic correspondence. Flowers appeared each morning in the schoolroom, never with a card, always white, always simple. But remorse, Clara had learned, could warm the air for a moment without rebuilding the hearth. A wound did not close because the person who caused it finally understood its shape. That night, Whitmore Hall hosted a small estate supper, not grand enough for society pages, but formal enough for neighbors, tenants of rank, and family associates to attend. Clara wore a gown of deep green velvet and the Whitmore diamonds at her throat because duty still had its ceremonies, even when the heart was tired of bowing. Alexander watched her from across the dining room with a guarded tenderness that would have undone her once. Now it only made her sad. Lady Margaret attended as well, seated near the fire, elegant and displeased. She had spoken little since Alexander's confrontation, but silence from her was not surrender. It was strategy resting. When the final course had been cleared, Mr. Caldwell, a widowed neighbor from Marblehead who had donated generously to the chapel school, rose to thank Clara for the winter relief efforts. His words were sincere, and the room listened. "There are families on Whitmore land," he said, "who would have gone hungry these past months if not for her Grace's attention. My late wife used to say that true nobility is not announced by a title, but revealed by what a person protects when no applause is promised. I believe Whitmore has been blessed with such a duchess." A soft murmur of approval moved through the guests. Clara lowered her eyes, not from false modesty, but because kindness offered publicly felt almost more dangerous than cruelty. Alexander looked proud, painfully proud, as though some part of him wished to stand and claim what he had neglected. Then Lady Margaret smiled. "How touching," she said. Her voice was light, almost sweet. "Charity is a graceful occupation for a woman awaiting her more essential purpose." The room chilled. Alexander's hand tightened around his glass. Before he could speak, Clara rose. Not quickly, not dramatically. She simply stood, and every conversation in the dining room died at once. The diamonds at her throat caught the candlelight, but her face remained calm. "Lady Margaret," she said, "I have spent 1 year being measured by what this house expected from my body, my obedience, and my silence. I have been patient with grief, patient with whispers, patient with locked doors and open letters. But patience is not the same as consent." Lady Margaret went pale beneath her powder. Alexander stood slowly. "Clara." She looked at him then, and he understood before she spoke that he was too late to prevent what dignity had already decided. From her finger, she removed the Whitmore ring. The room seemed to hold its breath as she placed it beside her untouched wineglass. The sound was small, a soft circle of gold meeting polished wood, yet to Alexander it rang louder than any accusation. Clara withdrew a folded note from the pocket sewn discreetly into her gown and laid it beside the ring. "I have arranged to stay at the chapel house until spring," she said. "The school needs me, and I require a quieter roof." Alexander's face lost color. "This is your home." "No, Your Grace," she answered gently. "It is your house. I have only been useful in it." He stepped around the table, but stopped before coming too near, as if even his sorrow had finally learned manners. "Do not leave because of my mother." Clara's eyes softened, and that softness wounded him more than anger could have. "I am not leaving because of your mother. I am leaving because for 1 year I disappeared in plain sight, and everyone found it convenient, including you." No one moved. Even Lady Margaret had no reply. Clara turned to the guests and inclined her head with perfect grace. "Forgive the interruption. Please continue your evening." Then she walked from the dining room without haste, without tears, without waiting to see whether he followed. Alexander remained beside the table, staring at the ring and the folded note. At last, with hands that no longer felt steady, he opened it. The message contained only one sentence. "I gave Whitmore everything except an heir. Forgive me for keeping my soul." Outside, the chapel bell marked the hour across the frozen grounds. Inside, Duke Alexander Whitmore stood among guests, candles, silver, and silence, understanding that his wife had not abandoned him. She had simply rescued the last living part of herself from the home where he had forgotten to love her. By dawn, Clara Whitmore no longer slept beneath the roof that carried her husband's name. The chapel house stood half a mile from Whitmore Hall, close enough for the mansion's chimneys to be seen beyond the bare elms, yet far enough that the silence inside felt chosen rather than imposed. It was a modest white cottage with blue shutters, 2 small bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a front room where schoolbooks, baskets of mending, and winter relief ledgers occupied every available table. Clara woke there on the first morning of March to the sound of gulls over the cliffs and children's voices gathering outside the schoolroom door. For the first time in a year, no servant waited to dress her, no family portrait watched from the wall, no silver bell reminded her that even solitude at Whitmore Hall had belonged to someone else. She made her own tea. She pinned her own hair. She opened the door herself when Emma arrived early with a slate under one arm and a bunch of snowdrops wrapped in brown paper. "For your table, Your Grace," the child said shyly. Clara knelt and accepted them as if they were diamonds. "Then my table is honored." By noon, half the village knew the Duchess had moved to the chapel house. By evening, all of Massachusetts society would know. The story changed with every carriage that carried it. Some said Clara had been dismissed. Some said she had rebelled. Some said the Duke was furious. Others that Lady Margaret had triumphed. The truth was quieter and more dangerous than gossip. Clara had not fled. She had stepped out from beneath a roof where her pain had been managed like an inconvenience and placed herself where her heart could breathe. Alexander did not come that first day. He watched from the west study as smoke rose from the chapel chimney and hated himself for understanding, at last, that love could not be summoned because loneliness had become uncomfortable. On the second day, he sent no note. On the third, he sent coal for the schoolhouse and food for the relief pantry, not under his own name, but under hers. Clara accepted the supplies and said nothing. On the fourth day, Dr. Samuel Hale arrived at Whitmore Hall uninvited, carrying a leather case and the expression of a man too old to fear aristocratic displeasure. Alexander received him in the library, where the curtains remained half-drawn against the afternoon glare. "Your Grace," the doctor said, "I should have come sooner." Alexander stood beside the cold fireplace. "Yes." Dr. Hale removed several papers from his case and placed them on the desk. Her Grace did not exaggerate her condition last spring. She was weak, frightened, and in need of familiar support. I wrote that clearly. I also wrote that future distress should be avoided, and that she should not be made to feel responsible for what happened. Alexander looked down at the physician's careful handwriting. Each line confirmed what Clara had endured. Each line made the room feel smaller. "Who received your report?" he asked, though he already knew. "Lady Margaret requested that all delicate matters pass through her until you returned from Boston. I was told you had been informed." The door opened before Alexander could answer. Lady Margaret entered, dressed in dark silk, her posture composed, her eyes immediately taking in the papers on the desk. "Dr. Hale," she said. "How unnecessary." The doctor bowed, but did not retreat. Truth often feels unnecessary to those who preferred the arrangement of silence. Lady Margaret's face hardened. Alexander turned toward her. "You told him I knew. I did what was required to protect you from distraction." "No," Alexander said. His voice remained quiet, and that quietness made the room colder. "You protected yourself from disorder." She drew herself up. "I protected Whitmore. I protected the line. I protected the dignity of a house that cannot be governed by a young woman's sorrow." Alexander stared at his mother for a long moment, and the final thread of boyhood loyalty broke without sound. "You protected the name and nearly murdered the home." Lady Margaret went still. Dr. Hale lowered his eyes, not out of fear, but respect for the grief entering the room. You will not speak of my wife as though her pain were poor management, Alexander continued. You will not call cruelty discipline because it wore gloves. You will not decide that a child lost in silence matters less because no cradle had yet been carved. For the first time, Lady Margaret had no graceful answer. Her lips parted, then closed. Outside, the chapel bell began to ring for afternoon lessons, its small sound carrying across the snow-softened grounds. Alexander looked toward the window. Through the bare branches, he could see the white cottage where Clara now stood among children who trusted her voice because he had once refused it. When he turned back, his decision had already settled into him. You will leave Whitmore Hall by the end of the week, he said. Lady Margaret's eyes flashed. You would send away your mother for her? Alexander picked up Clara's folded letter from the desk, the one sentence that had undone him more completely than any accusation. No, I am sending away the woman who taught this house to mistake silence for obedience. By sunset, the news had traveled through every corridor. Servants whispered, not with scandal, but with relief. Mrs. Ellery wept quietly in the linen room. Mr. Alden packed the household keys with shaking hands. And across the grounds, Clara stood at the chapel window, watching a single lamp burn in Alexander's study. She did not know every word that had been spoken. She did not yet know that the old order of Whitmore Hall had cracked. But when Emma asked why the big house looked different tonight, Clara looked through the glass at the distant windows and answered softly, perhaps because someone has finally opened a door. Spring did not arrive at Whitmore Hall all at once. It came cautiously, as if even the earth wished to be certain the cold had truly passed. Snow withdrew from the stone walls in narrow silver streams. The elms along the carriage road grew soft with pale green buds. Beyond the cliffs, the Atlantic changed from iron gray to a restless blue, and the chapel school opened its windows for the first time in months. Clara Whitmore remained at the chapel house through March, then April, not because she wished to punish Alexander, but because peace, once found, deserved protection. She taught the children each morning, balanced relief accounts in the afternoon, and walked alone at dusk with her shawl drawn close against the sea wind. Every day, before sunrise, a small bundle of white flowers appeared on the chapel steps. Sometimes snowdrops, sometimes early lilies from the greenhouse, sometimes wild violets, so carefully tied that Clara knew Alexander had not sent a servant. There was never a note. That mattered. A year ago, he had used words to close a door. Now he was learning that words offered too soon could become another form of demand. He came to the chapel house only when invited by necessity, to sign a school grant, to approve repairs, to deliver books from Boston packed in brown paper and string. He no longer stood too close. He no longer filled silence because it made him uncomfortable. When Clara spoke, he listened with an attention that was almost painful in its humility. When she did not speak, he did not punish the quiet with impatience. The county noticed. Of course it did. Society always noticed a woman who stepped away from unhappiness and a powerful man who did not drag her back. Lady Margaret left for Newport before Easter, taking her diamonds, her wounded pride, and the last remnants of the old household fear with her. Mr. Alden was retired with a pension Clara insisted be fair, though he had not deserved her generosity. Mrs. Ellery became house steward by Alexander's public order, the first woman in the county to hold such authority over a great estate, and no one dared question it after the Duke himself stood beside her in the great hall and placed the household keys in her hand. Yet none of these gestures brought Clara home. Alexander understood, slowly and then completely, that repair was not the same as return. In May, during the chapel school's spring gathering, the children decorated the room with apple blossoms and paper ribbons. Parents crowded along the walls. Mr. Caldwell stood near the door, smiling gently as Emma read a passage without stumbling once. When the applause ended, Clara turned and found Alexander at the back of the room, dressed simply in a dark coat, holding his hat in both hands like a man entering a church. He had come without announcement, not as host, not as master, only as someone hoping to be allowed to witness what she had built. After the children ran outside for cakes and lemonade, Clara remained behind to gather the books. Alexander approached one desk away and stopped. "May I help?" he asked. She looked at him across the scattered primers, and for the first time since winter, her eyes did not immediately retreat. "You may stack the slates." He did as instructed, awkwardly at first, then carefully, as if the small gray boards were sacred objects. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had changed shape. Outside, children laughed beneath the apple trees. Inside, dust moved through sunlight like gold powder. Alexander placed the final slate on the pile and drew a slow breath. I have spent months trying to decide what apology would be large enough, he said. There is none. Clara folded a ribbon around a bundle of books. No, I know. His voice roughened, but did not break. I asked life of you as though life could be ordered. I asked for an heir because I was afraid to ask for a heart. And when yours spoke quietly, I called it silence because listening would have required me to change. Clara's hand stilled. He did not step closer. I cannot ask you to return as if grief is a room that can be cleaned and reopened. I cannot ask you to forgive me because I have finally learned the cost of being unforgivable. I can only tell you that Whitmore Hall is no longer the house you left, and I am no longer willing to be the man who made you leave it. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Alexander accepted the silence, and perhaps that was the first true answer he had ever given her. At last, she looked toward the open window, where the big house could be seen beyond the green fields, softened by distance and spring light. A heart cannot be commanded, Your Grace. He bowed his head. Then teach me how to earn the right to hear yours. The title remained between them, but it no longer sounded like a wall. Clara picked up one book and placed it in his hands. Then begin by walking with me to deliver these to the North Cottages. He looked at the book as if she had given him something far more fragile. Now. They walked side by side down the chapel path, not touching, not reconciled in any easy, careless way, but moving in the same direction for the first time. Villagers paused. Children waved. Mrs. Ellery watched from the schoolhouse door with tears she made no effort to hide. When they reached the bend in the road, Clara slowed, and Alexander slowed with her. There, beneath the young leaves and the wide American sky, the Duke who had once demanded silence learned that redemption did not begin with being forgiven. It began with becoming safe enough for the wounded heart to speak again. Some silences are not empty. They are the final dignity of a heart waiting to be heard.